as the great Western patriarch who took on the Nazis. He did do that. One can't deny him that role. But Madhushree Mukherjee also tells us in the book she brought out 3 years ago that Winston Churchill, who was a dogged enemy of Hitler, and I quote, a resolute ally of the Americans, an inspiring leader through World War II, this Winston Churchill was also the same one who brilliantly opposed the barbarism of the Nazis. But a series of Churchill's decisions between 1940 and 1944 directly and inevitably led to the deaths of 3 million Indians. And what happened that killed 3 million Indians between 1940 and 1944? For those students who are studying the politics of development, I would urge you strongly to look at the politics of that famine, the Bengal famine of between 1940 and 1944. The streets of eastern Indian cities were lined with corpses. Yet instead of sending emergency food shipments, Churchill used the wheat and ships at his disposal to build stockpiles for feeding post-war Britain and Europe. This Churchill, who is venerated even by the Indian elite today, the elite sitting in our law bar associations and Supreme Court bar associations, was responsible for actually the callous murder of 3 million Indians. If not responsible, certainly responsible for turning away world attention from it, from not showing a humanity and a compassion that required it since he ruled over England. And I think this understanding and this absence of understanding of what colonial India did to our own people is something that informs and misguides the elite and the youth of today. 1984 was very important for 2 reasons in this country. In May of that year, you saw then Indian Prime Minister launch Operation Blue Star, and very controversial decision for which even Member of Parliament Khushwant Singh resigned his Rajya Sabha post. The Operation Blue Star was seen to be controversial because Mrs. Gandhi sent in the army inside the Golden Temple to finally control through force a man like Bhindranwale, the same person that she had helped and created in her bid to try and get at the more, quote-unquote, more moderate Akalis. So you had seen a kind of India which was in turmoil. It was an India which I came into journalism in 1983 to an India which was hugely questioned in terms of its thing. There were demands for Khalistan, there was a threat of a new partition. It was a very fractious time. And after 1984 May, when this happened, you saw her assassination take place on 31st October by her Sikh bodyguards. Ironically, her own security had told her possibly to remove Sikhs from her bodyguard, but she had said, no, I believe that every Indian is equal. Life is full of contradictions. She was killed, and after her death, you had 3 days of the worst massacre, or one of the worst massacres in post-independence India, of the Sikh community in the capital, Delhi, and all over the country as well, if you look at Kanpur, Nanded, and many other parts of India. You didn't have only this in 84. After the 84 post-assassination violence, you saw another kind of violence which took place in December 1984. I don't know how many of you would even recall it, but I'm sure the students of development know it very well. It was the Bhopal gas disaster. I mentioned this particularly relating it to my point about Churchill, is that just like you have this whitewashing of colonial, the impacts of colonial decisions and colonial rule, when colonial rule actually took place, you also have, in independent India, a complete hypocrisy through the multinational corporations. Union Carbide was exposed through a series of very, very strong investigations, largely by journalists, to show that they had a completely duplicitous policy of the way they dealt with methyl isocyanate, the gas that killed 10,000 people in Bhopal and debilitated almost 1.5 lakhs. Very different policy Union Carbide followed in third world India than what it followed in first world America or other countries. And that was exposed through a series of exposés by journalists, writers, social scientists, human rights activists working in Bhopal. And that controversy continued till 2010, when you recall, when the Olympics were taking place for 2011 when Dow Chemicals and one member of the Olympic Committee resigned because Dow Chemicals was a sponsor, Dow Chemicals being the modern day avatar of Union Carbide. Union Carbide has escaped moral, financial liability for the damage largely because of the decision of the Indian political class and the Indian judiciary. And I think that is something we need to reflect upon, because when we talk about systemic corrections, when we talk about generations who are able to critique what is happening, we need to understand where mentally we still remain, according to me, slaves to a certain kind of thinking. And this is one of the results of that kind of thinking. In Khoj, one of the things we try to do is to bring some eminent historians, eminent economists directly in touch with teachers. The school teacher eventually, in our system of things, is the delivery platform, not just for values, but for understanding of history and social studies. If any of us have developed a passion or love for history and social studies, it emerges largely because we've either had a very good teacher or a very bad one. So I think the role of the history or social studies teacher is very, very critical. And therefore we try and engage getting eminent historians in close conversation and consultation with school teachers. And Khoj has largely concentrated its work in state schools, that is Mumbai Mahanagar Palika schools, Thane Mumbai Mahanagar Palika schools, Zilla Parishad schools. We also have done some experimental work in some private schools, and some private schools have also adopted some of our modules. And we find some of these interactions and conversations between economists, historians, and history teachers fascinating. Because the history teacher really ends up saying that she has had no access to this information. The social studies teacher tells the historian or the economist that she has no time to reflect and research herself or himself, which doesn't give her the time to actually pass on a more original kind of information to the student. I really believe that the real challenge for India today, and that I think Azim Premji University is the best place to put this, I'm sure you're already grappling with it, is to be able to energize social studies and history teaching in our country at the base grassroots level. If we want social transformation, we have to do it there. Because it's only when our students at the grassroots level and our teachers at the grassroots level are able to think out of the box, look at solutions out of the box, critique our institutions, critique our past, critique our history, critique our present, that we'll be able to come up with creative solutions for the present and the future. One such interaction I must share with you is when we had Ms. Romila Thapar, we had Anirudh Keshuvan Veluthat from the Mangalore University, we had K.N. Panikar, and we had the 4 different periods of history being discussed. And it was the most fascinating experience. Romila for ancient, Keshuvan for early medieval, Anirudh this thing for medieval because Irfan Saab couldn't make it, Irfan Habib couldn't make it, and K.N. Panikar for modern. And all of them were actually talking to the history teacher about the need to decolonize the categorizations of history. And so I will be relying a lot on that workshop when I share with you how they went about it. As Romila said, that we have got this way of buying the historical framework from the colonizer, who either looked at our past in a Orientalist view or in a utilitarian view. There was no other way that the colonizer historian looked at it, and it's very important to understand that history is a ever-evolving discipline which needs to be looked at scientifically and from a multi-dimensional source. Romila's work, as I'm sure you've read, apart from ancient India and the work that she's done on it, her 3 lectures on Somnath and on Shakuntala are among my favorites when I'm giving examples to an audience like this. Somnath, because it plays on our consciousness even today in terms of communal ideologies. It's a lovely temple town located in a beautiful part of the world, the coastline of Gujarat, and it's a temple town that has attracted much attention, good and bad. Romila's work tells us, and this is first delivered at the Kosambi Lectures in Bombay University in 1999 and thereafter published, tells us that the entire myth around the Somnath invasion is very important to understand critically. If you look at the temple inscriptions, I mean, what are the original sources? If you look at Somnath Somnath is a temple. It's there in Gujarat. Gujarat as we know today, there was no Gujarat at that time. And we know that the Somnath temple, like many other temples, was invaded several times. Okay, so that, it's the Somnath invasion that she's looking at. And the Somnath invasion is very critical because before Muhammad of Ghazni invaded it, which he undoubtedly did in 13 AD, nobody is denying that invasion. But before that invasion, there were at least 46 other invasions by Paluka kings, other kings, neighborhood kings, etc., on the same temple treasury, etc. She goes on to tell us that there was a King Harshadev of Kashmir, region of Kashmir. All these names are now post facto. King Harshadev, who actually had an official government position of Deva Uttapana Nayaka, which was basically temple raising position. Now, why would a ruler need to have an officer in his bureaucracy whose sole job was to actually raise a temple or to invade a temple? Simply because temples and or mosques were known to be the repository of society's wealth. If I believed, if I was guilty, if I was in need of solace, I would not only go and pray there, but I would offer my wealth there, my personal wealth there. So they were repositories of a society's wealth, and therefore, every time Harshadev was in a fiscal crisis, he would instruct Deva Uttapana Nayaka to invade a temple. So if Harshadev did it, many other Chalukya and Pala kings did it for Somnath. Why does only Muhammad Ghazni acquire the kind of iconoclastic narrative in our history? For several reasons, she tells us. Not just for the Hindu communal one, even for the Muslim communal one. There are two narratives here which she tells us that of course the Hindu communal one is important because that's what we live with. But there was a Muslim communal one where he went back, which would also say that he did it in the name of Islam. Whereas actually he did it in the name of a lot of the wealth that was gathered there. Because the same Ghazni, as he went back from Gujarat via central India, via Pakistan, Takshila, back to where he came from, he also completely vandalized several townships along the way, which were entirely Muslim dominated. So, I mean, he was not particularly choosy about where he actually looted from. And we need to understand that. That was medieval world for you, that was the medieval world for you. Shivaji, where I come from, Shivaji is a much venerated ruler. He was a ruler of the peasant caste. He was a ruler who challenged Aurangzeb deeply because of the high taxation in the later feudal period, which he said was a great burden on the small farmer. In Marathi, he is known as the Riyasaton ka Raj. I mean, that's why he became so popular. But Shivaji did not take on Aurangzeb Hindu to Muslim. He took him on as a small, exploited chieftain vis-a-vis a large king. And he wrote 3 letters, in fact, to Aurangzeb, which revealed this. However, my textbook in Maharashtra, Standard 4, which deals with Shivaji for the whole book, spends 37 pages on the war with Afzal Khan, because Afzal Khan has a different meaning and Shivaji has a different meaning, And then I quickly switched to S.A. Dange, who was one of our veteran trade unionists from Maharashtra again. Many of you must be knowing about him. And the discourse on Shivaji is an old one, an ancient one in Maharashtra. When I say old and ancient, I mean as old and ancient as me and us, not in terms of history, 50, 100 years old, where Dange addressed a work meeting. Calico Mills, 1951. Brilliant speech, which we have transcribed and we give our teachers, where he says, Tyanche Shivaji, Amche Shivaji. Their Shivaji, our Shivaji. Don't confuse the two. Don't collapse the two. He is being made use of by communal ideologies today to propagate a certain othering, but Shivaji was different. So I think the real task for us as young persons grappling with historical images, sociological images, past and present, is to really deconstruct and understand our histories holistically. Aurangzeb, another guy, crazy, much vilified. He did what he did in terms of imposing the jizya tax without question. But he also gave grants to the Mathura and Kashi temples. As much as he did other things, he also raided the fort at Golconda, the mosque. Again, he raided the mosque because he wanted the wealth from there. So there are contradictions in history. The impulses in history were not Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Sikh. The impulses in history are often religious, but not only religious. They are often economic, social. They are driven by the practice of those times. And it's very, very important for modern day students, modern day teachers, to understand and project history in that light. For me, one of the major contradictions about the colonialism, and coming back to my original subject, is that much as we say what we want to say about the colonizer, the fact is, along with colonization came the missionary schools. And we know that the aim of missionary schools, or some of the missionary schools, might have been to possibly attract people towards Christianity. But we also know that but for the existence of some of these missionary schools, Jyotiba Phule would not have got educated, and you wouldn't have had the revolution at Travancore. So for the Dalit, for the Shudras, for a whole section of people, that was a liberative experience. So therefore, I say maybe we need to think of creative categories like the ideology of the proselytizer and the initiative of the proselytized. That what use the proselytized made of this proselytizing effort was not always to be used, but actually to liberate himself or herself from a certain caste barrier and consciousness. So these are contradictions. These are contradictions that our society reflects. These are contradictions that our polity reflects. But what really bothers me as a modern-day activist and educationist is that we are not really able to celebrate the path-breaking moments of our own history. 1848 and 1852 for me are very important because the first girls' school was set up in Bhidewada, Pune. And no girl in India knows of it. No girl in India celebrates it simply because it was a Savitribai Phule who set it up. And she set it up with 7 girls, 1 Brahmin, 1 Muslim, 1 Christian, 1 Chamar, 1 Mahar. I mean, can you believe what better symbol of national integration can you ever give your child? But our textbooks do not talk about the first girls' school to be set up in Bhilewada. And there's something we need to do about reclaiming our past and recreating the stories and narratives of our past. When Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule began their lifelong, it was a passion for them, something that for which they've ostracized all their lives, to educate the oppressed caste. They were actually ostracized by their own caste when they did it. And the persons to offer them shelter was one Usman Sheikh from Pune, who took them into their home. And the first teacher with Savitribai in her school was Fatima Sheikh. You just tell the story and you'll have a small little story of national integration. But it's when you don't want to have stories of national integration that we don't tell these stories. Another favorite story of mine is Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. He was there in my textbook in Maharashtra till 1974. Then suddenly he vanished. He's vanished. As you saw Hindu right-wing ideology rise, Ghaffar Khan was abandoned. Then we agitated. 2 years back, he's just come back. Now, why was Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan abandoned? It's an important question. You know, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was from the Northwest Frontier Province. He represented that very proud race called the Pathans, who were known to always believe that violence is the way and the method, a very proud race. But he completely got wedded to Gandhiji's principle of satyagraha and non-violence. So for the first time in the history of the subcontinent, you found the Pathans taking to non-violence, which was a kind of something the British couldn't cope with. Because you had the Khudai Khidmatgars being born, and you had actually a race that actually celebrated violence, saying that we believe in non-violence. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, at the last session of the Indian National Congress, when partition was accepted, cursed and screamed at the leadership of the Congress, saying, "You're throwing me to the wolves." If this quotation was there in our textbooks, if this story was there in our textbooks, I think the whole narrative of partition would come across as slightly more complex than we would like to portray. And I think we owe it to our history to portray this complex narrative, because that's what the reality was. Not every section of Muslims were for partition. Not every section of Hindus were against partition. We need to understand that. And the fact that there were people other side of the border, whether it was in Northwest Frontier Province or even in the Sindh, who said that the strength of India would lie in a united India, is a narrative that I think young people need to know about. Maulana Azad, our first education minister, the speech he made from the steps of the Jama Masjid around the time that partition took place, if you and I hear it today, it's on YouTube, please listen to it. It can bring tears to your eyes. It'll make your hair stand on end. because it's a scathing attack on the politics of the time. And a feeling that a whole section, a whole belief within the Muslim community is also critical of sections of the Muslim community. So it's not the kind of pussyfooting speech. It's a speech that we need to listen to. Because when a tumultuous event like partition takes place, from which we are scarred even today, because every riot that takes place, the dirty slogans that are raised hark back to Pakistan. I think we need to understand that 1 to 3 million people being killed, we don't have official figures of the numbers dead, 8 lakh people being forcibly displaced, is something that a society needs to grapple with, think about, make up its mind about. And I think that catharsis is only possible if you have honest conversations and an honest approach to history. And somewhere, because we are reluctant to talk about it, because we feel by pushing it under the carpet, it's a better way of dealing with it, that's when partisan views of partition gain credence, which are not necessarily untrue, but are untrue in the sense that they are selective. So what you need to do is to get the whole picture, not parts of the picture. So I would just like to urge that when we talk about, whether we talk about development, whether we talk about education, and because we're talking about education, one of the most important figures, I think, again in the colonial era, which is, I think, again, she's again ignored in our books, is Pandit Ramabai. I don't know how many of you study her. A woman, a Brahmin, widowed, deserted her religion, converted to Christianity, gave some of the most brilliant renderings before the Education Commission set up by the British, and then got so fed up by the way she was being used by established Christianity that she abandoned Christianity itself. So I think, it's a very important narrative to understand what happens to figures like this, the roles that they played. They reflect the different impulses of that time. Zakir Naik. How was Jamia Millia Islamia set up? The Jamia Millia Islamia today would have made Zakir Hussain cry. I'm sorry to say it. Because it was not set up as a Muslim university. It was set up as a university which was, वहाँ के लोगों का चंदा लेके the land was bought. It was bought through the contributions of individual people who wanted an indigenous form of education, not a Muslim form of education. But we have this habit of sectarianizing every aspect of our past and collapsing it into the present. So I think I would just like to, this is an amazing institution that has been set up, is in the process of finding its feet. I think one of the major contributions it can make is by breaking the barriers in terms of social studies and history teaching, because you'll have youngsters going out every year with new ideas, and I'm sure they're already there and you're already doing it, but I think the really tough subjects are sociology and history, and social sciences and history, because they are the subjects where outside there's a war being fought on a war footing. Thank you very, very much for listening so patiently. I'm happy to take any more questions. Yeah. I thought it's fair to give more time for questions.
Thank you, ma'am. I have a few questions, but the most important question that I want to know is, okay, now you said that the Hindutva history or the colonial history, all these are selective and biased, and they might not be the right way of looking at history. But one equally wonders if the other version of history that you and the so-called secular people project, how true it is, or how do we know which is true?
I'm taking 2-3 questions. I remember. I'm writing it down.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a nice talk, ma'am. There's just one question. What is the government positions on these things when you try to put across? Because government keep on changing, and we want to change really to bring the archives live to our lives.
One more.
Ma'am, in a Indian subcontinent, around 500 years, Muslims ruled a Hindu-dominant country. There was no revolt, but when the British colonized India, there was a revolt. So how do you differentiate these two?
I'll take the first question. See, to answer the question about which history, how do you believe? I don't think you should believe any history, but you should open your mind to asking questions of the precepts you are taught. Make up your own mind. There are several different versions available to you, but one thing about history is non-negotiable, that you must go to multiple sources. And you must try and go to contemporaneous sources. If you go to contemporaneous sources, you will find, like I think I have found, that many of the precepts that are being sold down to us, whether it is by, I mean, it's not just about Hindutva history. If you go to Pakistan, that's one example I forgot to give. I put my notes there. You've given me an opportunity. In Pakistan, the history starts not with Indus Valley. They start their history with the Mughals because they are ashamed of the Indus Valley because it's a pre-Islamic history. So don't think that the problem is just with Hindutva history. It's when you try and impose an ideology on history that you tend to look at it in a sectarian way. In Sri Lanka, you have two different histories being taught in the schools. One for Tamil children and one for Sinhala children. Nothing can be more disastrous for a society than that. Okay, so my thing is you don't necessarily believe what we are telling you. But if the questions that we are raising interest you or excite you, try and find out the answer for yourself. And that much I think we owe ourselves as adults, is that if the question bothers us, if there is a contradiction, then we should ask the questions and find out the truth. Very good question on government, this thing. It's a very, very, see there are 3 or 4 issues here. One is in 2004, after the first UPA government came to power, because of the obvious efforts to change the value education and all by the Murli Manohar Joshi regime, there was a whole movement and Arjun Singh set up a committee, etc., etc. So some of the new NCERT textbooks came out. Now many things about the new NCERT textbooks are welcome. But some of the problems is that they don't have a linear rendering of history. So in fact, they've left a lot of confusion because the UPA one solution was to avoid the problematic areas, not to deal with them. Now that's not really the best way of dealing with an issue. So that's at the central government level. So it's like you take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But I think our best bet is that advocacy should continue. And today when you have internet, and I know I've been having this huge dialogue as to how democratic is our internet, because I think in India our internet is just 20% of the population. In Brazil it's 50%. But I think a lot of this information can be put there to be understood and discussed, particularly in multiple languages. At the state government level, I find huge resistance. When I gave the example about Maharashtra and Shivaji, a state which is known for its progressive past, today has got the most retrogressive textbooks. You know? So it's difficult, it's very difficult, this advocacy, but I think we have no option but to attempt it in different ways. The question of 100 years of this thing rule, I would just like to poke a hole in your question itself, because I don't think you can call 500 years of Turkish, Afghan, this thing rule as Muslim rule, because that itself is a problem. The moment you construct it as Muslim, Christian or Hindu, the problems begin. The issue is that you had certain rulers coming from different parts of the world, settling here. They might have belonged to one religion, but they made this country their home. So the wealth stayed here. The economic stayed here. It was not taken, it was very feudal. It was not very egalitarian, but it was certainly not colonizing. Colonization means when you actually exploit a local market and local agriculture and take it out, and the wealth is actually benefited outside. But I think just seriously question your category of 500 years of Muslim rule, because there's a problem there. There were different cultures, there were different kingdoms, there were different dynasties. So I don't think you can club it together in one religion. I don't know if I've answered some of the questions. That's right, multi-religious ruling. Yeah.
We'll just, since I'm here.
Thank you, ma'am. I have a question that we are just making some comparison in this talk. So I just wondering, people of India love so much Akbar, but why don't Indian people loved Aurangzeb? And after the Aurangzeb ruling, almost the Mughal Empire has been started going down. What happened with that?
No, I didn't understand the question. You said people love Akbar but don't love Aurangzeb?
I just said when we did the comparison that there was contradiction that not due to the religion people used to follow or revolt against the empire at that time, but the same time in the same history Akbar had been praised in Indian condition. Even the most of the Hindu kings or they just offered, they served Akbar. Yeah. But why not they served Aurangzeb? And after the ruling of Aurangzeb, Indian and this Mughal Empire has just started falling down. What happened with that?
Ma'am, it may be a following of Mr. That Bai's question. Apart from this Indian government's endeavor, you, I think, coach the cost, you are doing your best to do the pluralistic education system in India. And I want to know how do you approach it for this case? And as a students, how do we approach this case to a pluralistic education system?
Hello, ma'am. That's the next one. Okay. Ma'am, from standard 3 to, till now, I have heard several accounts of assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. First time I actually read about it in my Sanskrit text in standard 3rd or 4th, I guess. There it was written that he was assassinated by a person named Nathuram Godse. Now, when in the same state board, in standard the same line is written as Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu fundamentalist Nathuram Godse. And again in standard 10, then in CBSE board, now he again becomes a fanatic, not Hindu, fanatic Nathuram Godse. Actually, for a kid it doesn't matter. The name does matter, but as an academic, when we are actually thinking in such detail, why can't we, even after 66 years of independence, we are not able to standardize our education system from central education to a state education? That was my question.
Will you answer or will you take 2 more questions?
No, I'll just answer these 3. Sorry. The first one was about Akbar. I think it's an important question because I consciously didn't talk about Akbar today because it's one of the things I would go on for hours about. But I consciously didn't because it's one of my engagements on this whole issue of Khoj, and it's connected to the second question also. In Khoj, we try to create alternate supplementary materials to use at the school level. Okay, so apart from many modules on history, we also have this module on history of religions. Okay, history of different religions, not a religious story, but a sociological history of religions, how they were born, under what circumstances, etc. And believe me, one has had more opposition from schools dominated by Muslim groups when we are teaching about other religions than about others. And I think this is something we need to grapple with. Because our argument with always that we are living in a diverse society, then other religions, at least their genesis, their understanding of the religion must be taught. But somehow there's a reluctance among those schools where they are dominated by large Muslim groups to teach about other religions. Finally, they come around when we have long discussions with them, PTA meetings, etc. And funnily enough, when we teach about different religions, I find Muslim children getting most attracted towards Jainism. So, that's one of the other papers I'm writing. It's a very funny thing. But I think this Akbar thing, somewhere, I'm answering this question to tell you that Akbar is a figure who's fascinating because of the practices he adopted in his personal life when he was ruling a very diverse and plural country like India. And I think for that reason, he's very important as a king, apart from the fact that after Ashoka, India was the most consolidated as a subcontinent under Akbar after Ashoka. But if you look at the narrative of the modern Muslim consciousness, Akbar is not a favorite. So, these are some of the dichotomies we face and we need to grapple with when we are looking, because it's not simply talking to the majority when we talk about communalism, there is also minority communalism. And Aurangzeb's treatment of his brother Dara Shikoh, I think, is an important illustration of the man Aurangzeb was, because he was cruel. Apart from the fact that he might have had more Hindus in his army than even Akbar did. So he was not communal, but he was certainly could not tolerate the Sufism that Dara Shikoh represented, which Akbar adored because Akbar had the Chishti tomb in his palace, etc. So, there are contradictions within our appropriation of different images. And if we are able to step back from our gender identity, religious identities, our multiple identities, and look at history rationally and holistically, then I think we'd give a more fair rendering to it. The last question was about how the terminology used for Godse, and that why can't we use uniform terminology? I'm not sure uniformity is the answer, because, let's face it, India is a country with so much diversity, and you will be actually going in an anti-constitutional way, because under the constitution, education is on the concurrent list, which means it's a state subject and a central subject. So you can both have a central rendering and you can also have a regional rendering. But my point is something else. It's not a question of whether you call him fundamentalist or fanatic or Hindu. My question is, should you not be able to explain to the young mind why it was necessary for a certain force to eliminate Gandhi? I think that's more critical, not just the terminology that is used. Because if we are not able to understand and grapple with that ourselves, then we are reluctant to explain it to the young. And let's face it, even today there are people in our midst who are celebrating Godse. In fact, one of my most favorite slogans is that, Gandhi hum sharminda hai, tumhare qatil zinda hai. So there is that, it's a very live problem today. So I think it's more that, I don't think we can talk about uniformalizing. I think children are able, young people are able to grapple with a lot of complexities. But at least we should be able to honestly impart a certain reasoning behind why certain actions take place or certain events take place. Sorry, which one was that? About Khoj. About, yeah. Yeah.
Should I go ahead?
Please.
Namaskar, ma'am. My question is that do you want decolonization of history just to provide the alternate approach or to put focus on our past, or to cater the need of the modern Indian society, that is to create the social harmony and those kind of things? Because whatever you say, the decolonization which is very much necessary, and the example you have given of Ghazni and other temple raising, and the reason that is fiscal deficit, it is acceptable. But if you see the Aurangzeb regime, in the second half of Aurangzeb regime, we can see that he adopted completely a communal policy. There was no fiscal deficit or something. So, in the name of decolonization of history, are we going aside, or are we going, मतलब हम दूर जा रहे truth से? Is it not problematic?
Yeah, please.
Hand up here, but since it's related, it better be related now.
Actually, I was just thinking, I just don't know whether it is a question or whether it is a comment. I'm quite confused. Basically, मेरा question थोड़ा वर्तमान से जुड़ा हुआ है. जैसे आप एक सिंपल उदाहरण ले लीजिए कि आज हम मतलब ये द्रोणाचार्य पुरस्कार बांटते हैं, तो ये क्वाइट कॉन्ट्राडिक्टरी है पूरी तरह से, क्योंकि जिसने एकलव्य का अंगूठा मांग लिया और ये उस नाम पर हम किस तरह से द्रोणाचार्य पुरस्कार बांट सकते हैं. आप अगर नवीन जिंदल को देख लीजिए, जहां मैंने एक बार फेसबुक में पढ़ा था, वो एक किताब पढ़ाते हैं जिसमें वो इस तरीके से अपने आप को प्रोपोगेट करते हैं कि उन्होंने दिन में झंडा फहराने के लिए बहुत बड़ी लड़ाई लड़ी है इंडियन स्टेट से, और जो कि पढ़ाई जाती है. ठीक है, एक और उदाहरण ले लीजिए कि जब बाल ठाकरे मर गए तो जी, तो न्यूज पे आने लगा कि शायद उनकी एक समाधि बनाई जाएगी कोई अच्छे मंदिर, अच्छे मैदान में. कल हो सकता है लालू प्रसाद यादव मरे और गांधी मैदान में उनकी समाधि बन जाएगी. दूसरी बात, हमारे यहाँ नीतीश कुमार की माताजी मर गई. अब एक राष्ट्रीय और एक बहुत अच्छा सामोरा होता है, लोग जाते हैं और माताजी को, और कल हो सकता है वो माता बिहार माता बन जाए. नहीं मेरी तो सो माय क्वेश्चन इज कि ठीक है, जो समस्या इनका था, तो मेरा चूंकि हम पढ़ाते हैं तो एक आदर्श भी स्थापित करते हैं, एक सत्य भी स्थापित करते हैं। आदर्शों के द्वारा शायद हम सत्य स्थापित करते हैं, क्योंकि यहाँ पे एक आदर्श कॉन्टेस्टेड कंसेप्ट है आपके इस फ्रेमवर्क में, तो सत्य भी एक कॉन्टेस्टेड कंसेप्ट है, सत्य अलग अलग है किसका। तो आप ये जो तर्क है इन तथ्यों को खोजने के पीछे, उभारने के पीछे, वो आदर्श स्थापित करने की या सत्य स्थापित करने की? क्योंकि ये पूरा मामला एक आदर्श से जुड़ा हुआ है। कल हो सकता है कि कल हो सकता है कि जैसे कि मान लीजिए आप छोड़िए, दैट्स फाइन, ओके, हाँ ठीक है, ठीक है।
कोई प्रॉब्लम।
जैसे मान लीजिए कल, हाँ, पूंजीवाद अगर एक आदर्श के रूप में स्थापित हो जाए तो शायद वो धीरू भाई अंबानी कल भगवान बन जाएंगे।
हाँ।
तो फिर बात वही है कि हम क्या स्थापित करना चाहते हैं। दैट्स ऑल माय क्वेश्चन।
Hi, I like the point that you said how history can be used for national integration. As a student development, I'd be interested to know if by introducing some of the concepts of history in the school education, is it also possible to create citizens who are more sensitive or aware about some of the more tangible and visible issues? Or perhaps, as a solution to issues like, say, left-wing extremism or gender biases in Indian society. I think that's where I'd be interested to know how history can be used in school education. So if you can respond to that.
देखिए, आपने जो पॉइंट कहा था औरंगजेब के बारे में, मैं हिंदी में बोलूँगी सो यू कैन अंडरस्टैंड। औरंगजेब के बारे में जो आपने कहा था कि देखिए, सवाल नहीं है कि हम किसको क्या छुपा रहे क्या रख रहे। अगर आप वही बात, चाहे वो औरंगजेब की हो या जब बौद्ध मंदिरों को गिराए गए, क्योंकि बौद्ध मंदिरों को भी बहुत भी गिराए गए हिंदुस्तान में, मगर उसका तो हमारे पास कोई विश्लेषण नहीं है हमारी किताब में। बौद्ध धर्म जो यहाँ पे पैदा हुआ था वो अभी एक देश से ही बाहर हो गया। तो सवाल नहीं है कि औरंगजेब को आप छुपा छुपी करके करो, आप सही ढंग से, मगर अगर आपके दृश्य में नफरत नहीं है तो आप वो उदाहरण भी आप रैशनली देंगे। अभी टिप्पू सुल्तान का मैं आपको उदाहरण दूं। टिप्पू सुल्तान ऐसा इंसान है जिसके बारे में कई पॉलिसीज के बारे में आप कह सकते हैं कि वो ऐसी थी, मगर वहाँ पे दलित ओबीसी के लिए रिजर्वेशन भी हुआ, जैसे साहू महाराज के ज़माने में हुआ। ही ऑल्सो वॉज वन ऑफ द स्मॉल chieftains who died fighting the ब्रिटिश। और हो सकता है उनके अंदर कुछ और भी चीज़ें हो। तो सवाल ये नहीं है कि सत्य को छुपाने का, मगर अगर इतिहास को एक व्हीकल आप बना ले आज के पॉलिटिक्स के लिए, लोगों को डिवाइड करने के लिए, तो फिर आपको प्रॉब्लम होगा। मुझे ना अकबर की बुराई छुपानी है ना औरंगजेब की अच्छाई छुपानी। अगर ये मेरा देश होगा, ना मैं औरंगजेब को मुस्लिम रूलर कहूंगी, क्योंकि वो आधार पे अगर मैं इतिहास को देखूंगी जाति और धर्म पे, तो न सिर्फ वो आज के लिए खतरा है मगर उस वक्त के लिए असत्य था, क्योंकि वो मुस्लिम हिंदू लेके वो राज्य नहीं कर रहे थे, है ना। और जहां तक बात आदर्श और सत्य की है, सत्य भी ऐसी चीज है, वो अलग अलग लोगों का सत्य अलग हो सकता है, करेक्ट। जहां पे जात में, देश जात में बिचा हो, क्लास में बटा हो वगैरह, मगर अगर हमारा कम से कम ये एक मिनिमम ये हो कि हम जब इतिहास को देखेंगे या विश्लेषण करेंगे तो कुछ छुपाने की बात ना हो और इस तरह का रैशनली उसको ऑब्जर्व करने की बात हो, तो हो सकता है बात बन सकती है। आपने तीनों जो उदाहरण दिए वो बिल्कुल सही, उसके हम 15 और भी जोड़ सकते हैं। मैं आपको बताऊं, सबसे विवादित आज ये डिबेट होगा जो व्यक्ति से लेकर नहीं है, मगर वो न्यूक्लियर एनर्जी पे है, जो सब्जेक्ट किसी को टच ही नहीं करना है। अब अगर मैं बात करूं न्यूक्लियर एनर्जी पे तो मैं कई बातें करूंगी, दूसरे कहेंगे ये तो बस विकास की दुश्मन है, न्यूक्लियर एनर्जी के खिलाफ है ये। तो ये तो कोई व्यक्ति से इससे बात नहीं जुड़ी ना, ये एक डेवलपमेंट का एक आधार है कि डू वी वांट न्यूक्लियर एनर्जी और नॉट। बट दैट काइंड ऑफ डिबेट, आई मीन इट्स अ वेरी डिविजिव डिबेट। मतलब हो सकता है कोई भी कमरे में उसका 2 फुट हो जाए, क्योंकि न्यूक्लियर एनर्जी को लेकर इतना विवाद है हमारे समाज में, हमारे राजनीति में, हमारे आर्थिक नीति में, सब कुछ में। तो ये तो है, ये दौर ये दौर के थ्रू हम गुजर रहे हैं, मगर हम ये कैसे मान सकते हैं कि दूसरे दौर में ये ऐसी बातें नहीं थी? हो सकता थी। एकलव्य की कहानी, अगर आप कहेंगे कि आप एकलव्य की कहानी होनी चाहिए तो द्रोणाचार्य अवार्ड नहीं देना चाहिए, क्योंकि एकलव्य का अवार्ड देना चाहिए, बराबर। और वही बात सावित्रीबाई फुले और आप किसको शिक्षण दिन कभी आप ऑब्जर्व करेंगे, 5 सितंबर को या 3 जनवरी को? फिलहाल हम दोनों कर रहे हैं। हमारी बात जहां खोज की बात है हम दोनों कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि हम ये विवाद के थ्रू हम जा रहे हैं, मगर कहीं ना कहीं हमें को ढूंढना तो पड़ेगा ना रास्ता। हम राधा कृष्णन का 5 सितंबर करेंगे या सावित्रीबाई फुले का 3 जनवरी करेंगे? हम दोनों करते हैं। Sorry. I just thought. Oh, yeah, sorry. I feel the Khoj began its impulse. Khoj ने जो काम शुरू किया वो it began its impulse on the whole communal issue, but we have gone way beyond that. We are looking at the whole issue of caste, we are looking at the issue of region, look at the issue of gender and also alternate development. So we really believe that history is not just about understanding the past, but it teaches us of how to deal with the present and the future. Because it's a discipline which has organically linked to the present and the future. So therefore, इतिहास और सामाजिक शिक्षण सिर्फ इसलिए ज़रूरी नहीं है कि हम हमारे पीछे साल को कैसे समझें, मगर अभी जिंदगी हम कैसा उसको राजनीति में कैसा हैंडल करें और फ्यूचर के लिए बच्चों के लिए हम कैसा पेश आए. It's very, very critical for the future also. Because I think many of the mistakes we've made in the past. For an example, I'll tell you about Sri Lanka. I mean, Sri Lanka remains to me a very important example because communalism as a term has been interpreted as a misuse of religion and religious symbols for political ends. To be communal is not to be religious. Okay, a religious person need not be communal. It is only the misuse of religion and religious symbols that is communalism. In all the 25-30 years of our work, one society where I felt immediate understanding of the term was Sri Lanka. Because that small country has been racked apart by communal politics. And you know, we talk about Hindu, Muslim, Dalit, but in Sri Lanka, it was a simple matter of excluding Tamil as an official language in the 1953 constitution, which created such a deep schism. And only the left opposed it. When the ruling parties tried to exclude Tamil, the left said that you are sowing the seeds of partition. And that is exactly what happened in that country. So the question is to be able to understand the past, not to repeat the mistakes for the future. It's very, very important. What led up to partition? I mean, 1905 में जब बंगाल में when British tried to partition Bengal, Rabindranath Tagore's famous song, which we sing even today, and Muslim and Hindu Bengalis came on the street and said, "How dare you? Don't partition us." What changed so dramatically in 35-40 years that there was bloodshed in every town and village in Punjab, Bihar, Delhi, and Bengal. So we need to understand that how can it change so fast? Because we need to prevent it on repeating itself.
Ma'am, my question is related to what you said right now. I was wondering if Indian history, somewhere down the line, would now misrepresent Bangladeshi immigrants, Nepali immigrants, Tamil immigrants in India. And I mean, I fear that there would be bloodshed in the near future if such a thing is done.
Hello, ma'am. I'm from Indian Express, Aditya. You're a strong critic of Narendra Modi, and you've been fighting for the 2002 rights
You want to bring
victims.
that here,
No,
or-
I'm very happy for that, and I'm just appreciating it. In this forum, I'm just appreciating it. The question I want to ask is, how about changing the history with the politicians are doing right now? Narendra Modi is taking Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who eventually was a man who actually banned RSS for the death of Gandhiji. So now they are saying Sardar Bhai belongs to BJP or RSS or the Seva Sangh, whoever it is. And Congress is actually in the backfire because they've never promoted him. They've always kept the Nehru family
Only-
intact.
only-
After Sonia came, all the projects that were done under UPA were
Rajiv
under
Gandhi.
the Gandhi family, names of Gandhi family. So the whole history has to change. The Gandhi families rule India. They demand the history, so it has to change.
I agree.
Don't you think?
There's not a word I disagree with. I'll only add to it and say, I'll add one bit to it and say that not only did Sardar Patel ban the RSS, but in the letter he wrote, he said they distributed sweets when Gandhi died. So though the person who might have killed him was with the Hindu Mahasabha at that particular point of time, the joy was all around. And sorry, you've not finished.
There's also irony that Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel actually invited RSS to join Congress if they're actually giving up their ideology of right-wing terrorism. So that point is also there.
But Bhadra Joshi, along with Mrinalini Sarabhai were like tigresses with the victims of partition, and the refugees. They worked very hard in the refugee camps and they were symbols of communal harmony. Now, D.R. Goel, in his youth, was with the RSS. So, if I believe that a person can reform and change, the invitation by Patel must have been that if you give up your anti-constitutional principles, if you give up your hardline principles, then you come into the Congress. And Congress had that tradition of having right-wingers, left-wingers, everybody. The point is, do you give up your anti-constitutionalism? Do you give up your abhorrence for the tricolor? You have to be, it has to be a real change. It cannot be a tactical shift. Today's shifting parties is a tactical shift because you want a seat or you want to win an election. But if it's an actual ideological shift, I believe every human being can reform. So it's the same thing that, Tony Blair I criticize for all his role in the Iraq war, but what he did with the Irish is legendary. He actually called them to the table and he managed to actually get Sinn Féin to lay down arms. So if you don't believe that people can change or reform, then you're not a statesman or a stateswoman, So I think that's important. And we are living through a very difficult time where the history of the Indian National Congress has been reduced to the history of one family. Like I said, what about Gopal Krishna Gokhale? What about Dadabhai Naoroji? These are also congressmen and women, Sarojini Naidu. There were so many contributors to the freedom, even under the National Congress, but it seems to be seen as the fiefdom of one family, and that's not a healthy tradition at all.
Namaste. Here.
Sorry.
I like your, I very much like your point when you talked about politicizing Shivaji. For that matter, I would like to ask, how do we go about thinking in your framework about, let's say, for example, removing a picture showing Shivaji and Afzal Khan happening at Pratapgarh? That is my first question. I have two even smaller questions. Another question is, I think they are related. Can I take them? Yeah. In history about the current years, let's say past 20, 30 years or more than that, or like happening last year, etc. The incidences will in the framework that you are trying to say, will we include this into our history? Do we need them or do we want to exclude them? For example, first, Assam, Mumbai, and second, spread of Christianity in northeastern states. That's it.
Sorry. Sorry.
Ma'am, good evening.
Good evening.
My question is, मैं हिंदी बोलता हूँ. मैंने MJ अकबर की एक किताब पढ़ी थी, The Future and Past of Pakistan. उन्होंने उसमें लिखा है कि nations are not born across the breakfast table. ये उन्होंने कहा कि हिस्टोरिकल था. उन्होंने कहा था कि औरंगजेब के जो गुरु थे, वो और औरंगजेब के जो टीचर थे बेसिकली, he was very communal, और जिसको हम लोग बोलते हैं कि वो धर्म को लेकर के काफ़ी फैनेटिक थे. तो उन्होंने उनको उस हिसाब से नर्चरिंग किया कि वो काफ़ी उस हिसाब से तैयार हो गए थे, और उनकी जो भी पॉलिसीज़ थी वो इसीलिए कुछ कट्टर माना जाता है. तो उसके बाद उन्होंने लिखा है कि ये जो डिवीज़न हुआ था वो कहीं ना कहीं हिस्टोरिकल रहा है. जो उस समय से डोमिनेशन जो धीरे धीरे मुस्लिम रूलर्स का जो डोमिनेशन धीरे धीरे ख़त्म होने लगा, तो वो कहीं ना कहीं बाकी ग्रुप के दिमाग में बैठी थी, और उसके दंश में ये लोग फिर कहीं ना कहीं 1947 का जो वो था उसी का एक परिणाम था. उसके बाद फिर हमारे यहाँ जो एक गवर्नमेंट रही जिसकी मोनोपोली रही लगभग 60 साल रही, तो वो खासकर ऐसे वर्गों के लिए ना रोजगार दे पाए, ना उनको शिक्षा दे पाए, ना हमें ऐसा इतिहास दे पाए कि हम इन चीज़ों को कभी मतलब एक अच्छे वे में लेके चले. फिर ये पॉइंट जो कम्युनल और सेक्युलर का जो बीच का होता है, ये टेंशन मेरा पूछना है कि ये भी हिस्टोरिक है या फिर लीडर्स के द्वारा क्रिएटेड है.
One more question.
Yeah.
Ram, and then we'll close.
Thank you. This might be a little long. I think we are missing the woods for the trees in this whole discussion here. You made some allusions to it, but I think the audience have lost it. As long as you are tyrannized with the historical facts, see, we are confusing history with history education. If you view history education as only historical facts, we are not going to get anywhere outside this debate. It will be this person's history, it will be that person's history. History education has to be about the process of history. Historical facts can help in that process, but unless you get the idea of what history is, how do you ascertain historical facts? And that's what school history education should be about. And then, as she said rightly, then it leaves the judgment of that person who's reading her history to see whether they accept that history. So if we continue with this debate that should we put this fact there or instead of that fact there, it will be endless. So history education is about historical facts. It's not a question. I'm making a comment. You can respond to that.
Thank you.
So there's one more question and we can close with this. She's had her hand up.
So I'm asking this question to you in the capacity of an activist. So if I think of trying to in society broaden the vision of history, along with the political resistance that you face, the other resistance that I can think of is the inherited family narrative. So as an activist, when you're trying to broaden the vision of the student, what kind of, how do you navigate that space of contradicting the family narrative?
I will, there's one more. No. I will take that third question first because it gave me great relief when I heard that. You see, the point that I was making, whether it is about the impact of colonialism or understanding what colonialism is or understanding what ancient India is, whether it was Hindu or not, or what medieval India is, the way we approach our history and our historical, the gaining of historical knowledge. A lot of that has got to be with how we approach our sources, contemporaneous sources, interpretative sources, etc. And like the question put in the first round itself is that why should we believe this history that you're telling us today rather than something else? The point is not that. The point is, are you approaching the process of history in the understanding of historical periods, historical personalities, historical developments with some degree of interconnectivity, rationality, and some criterion? Now, if those criteria are not clear in our heads, we will continue to be misled by different aspects of it. I want to just, something I touched upon Somnath and then I went to something else, but I just want to give an example again to tell you what I mean. That the narrative of Somnath has been misinterpreted at multiple levels. So, like I said, there was the Islamicist misrepresentation of it. It wanted to glorify the Wraiths for their own reading. And there is today a modern Indian Hindutva rendering of Somnath, which is very interesting. 1857, I told you, happened. 1857 was the first War of Independence. There was brutal crushing of the War of Independence. You had 7 lakh Indians being killed in Delhi alone. A large number of them were Muslims who had resisted the British. And that narrative is missing from our text. Okay, that whole revolt is missing from our text. It is when British India is suddenly facing a united rebellion from India, which is united, that you find suddenly a debate in the British Parliament taking place on the gates of Ghazni, the gates of the Somnath temple. Suddenly there's a debate in the British Parliament which said that let's bring back the Somnath temple gates from somewhere in modern day Afghanistan. Until 1848, there is no mention in the Privy Council debates about this. Then suddenly you find in 1920 K.T. Munshi, who's an ideologue of the Hindutva, he's also in the first cabinet of Nehru, from Gujarat, who writes the book Jai Somnath. That Jai Somnath, I have a copy, went into 10 editions. Because that narrative was what researched the whole thing about get our Somnath back, means get Hindu Somnath back from the Muslims. Now very strangely, Romila tells us this, Thapar, and then she goes back to the contemporaneous sources, which is the temple inscriptions in Sanskrit, which are still there. You and I can go and see them in the temple, if you understand. And she reads the Sanskrit inscriptions and she reads the Pali inscriptions, and she tells us that the temple authorities, there was a Panchkula which ran the temple. Panchkula was, the priest, the town head, the village head, etc., who looked after the administration of the temple land. And the Panchkula of the Somnath temple, 400 years after the last invasion by Ghazni, had given part of the temple land to one Nuruddin Firoj to construct a mosque. The question she asks is, if there was this Hindu angst about Ghazni's invasions, why would the Panchkula contemporaneously give this land to this, and who was Nuruddin Firoj? He was an Arabian businessman who used to go between West Asia and Gujarat for his trading wares. He did a lot of business, did a lot of philanthropy, so they decided to give him some land for his religious place and his mosque. The question is, the construct of Hindu angst is a 19th and 20th century construct. There was no Hindu angst contemporaneously. It was constructed for the British for their own purposes and for the Hindu right wing for their own purposes. That is the kind of rationality we need to engage with when we understand history, is the process of history learning. How is history accumulated? Why is Shivaji, before I answer your question, how will we take out that painting? I mean, why was Afzal Khan and Shivaji put up there? Because it was part of modern day politics. That the war of Shivaji on Afzal Khan is being translated in metaphor to mean the ongoing war today against India's Muslims. That is a metaphor. And unless we are able to deconstruct that metaphor and dialogue with the people who put up that, we won't be able to remove that photograph. There's no shortcut to it. It has to be a dialogue that, why do we need this symbol? We do these teachers' workshops in Khoj. We do these teachers' workshops. And we do this workshop about Shivaji. And we ask the teachers what they feel. And one teacher in one workshop told me that there are many Afzals in my classroom. What do I understand about that teacher when she says it? And another teacher in the same month in another school had tears in her eyes, and she said, I feel so ashamed when I read out that part of the textbook because I don't like teaching it in my class. So it's a question of how you approach that. Why is it making one teacher very celebratory, and why is it making another teacher so uncomfortable? I think we need to engage in this deconstruction of what's there in the text, what actual history is, how do we capture that real history, what are the sources, what are the contemporary sources, what are the techniques. One module we do in Khoj, where we engage children, family, community, is exploring of migratory histories of every child. If the module was in Bangalore, I would do it for Bangalore, but I do it in Mumbai, I do it in Pune, I do it in Thane. आप कहाँ से आए? कौन सा गांव? कौन सा जिला? When did you first move here? Are you originally from this area? Which part did you first come to? Where do you stay? Are you in touch with your original village? Trace your own family's migratory history and exchange it in the classroom. I cannot tell you what a difference that module makes to the color of the classroom. Suddenly the classroom, which was monocolored, becomes so, there's one Marwadi speaking, one Kannada speaking, one Tamil speaking, one child, and they're all finding out on their own, did they come 50 years ago, did they come 100 years ago, did they come 10 years back, did they come 5 years back. I still remember the first time I experimented, because I conceived this module in 1996. First time I tried it out, and my hair stood on end, because I have the arrogance of being a Bombayite, a Mumbaikar, for 8 generations. So I believe Bombay is my place. My people have come from Gujarat 8 generations ago. Who can talk? I can't, nobody can say I'm not a Bombayite, right? And this young girl wrote a 300-word migratory history that chilled me. Her parents had migrated from Lahore during partition. They had settled in Kashmir. Okay? They happened to be Pandits. Again, during 89-90, when the Kashmiri Pandits had to leave, they had to leave. And you know what that essay of hers said? That this is the first time I'm being asked to write about my family. And my mother always tells me that Mumbai has made us our home today, but we might again have to leave tomorrow. I was chilled because, and for me, thinking that, when I devise this model, realizing that how different an experience of the same Bombay can be for a family that has had to, in 40 years, shift with nothing on their backs twice. So it's also a question of how we understand, and then you have our migrant laborers who do it anyway for no other traumatic reason but for economic necessity. So I think we need to be able to develop some of these narratives as alternate ways to understand history. I think I've left out some issues after tackling this, but one of the questions about, one was about the photograph, the other one was what? Current. See, according to me, as a social studies teacher, and this is a dialogue I have with teachers all the time, I believe today's world, you have to engage with current events for the child. Because today the media is distorting images, is invading the home, invading consciousness, not necessarily in the most balanced way. So unless, and this is, I'm talking about electronic media, not about the print so much. So I feel it's very important that the classroom space is opened. Classroom space is open for some discourse on current day events. Because if we don't do it, you are not, and I think we should do it with the standpoint of allowing the child to critique the media. So one way we do it is we have a Khoj Khabar Day once a week, where we ask different versions of the same event to be discussed in the classroom. So you invariably find that 3 newspapers will have different interpretations of the same event. So if you find discussions on it, slowly the young mind it grows up with the capacity to not become a consumer or a victim, but become a critique. And that's the best way I've found to be able to deal with it. I mean, there may be other ways, but I feel, I mean, teachers are constantly saying you are talking about a very noisy classroom. So I said, yeah, but it's the right kind of noise.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. निकाल दो